everybody. This is Science Bridge webinar series, and today I have a very special guest. I'm going to be speaking with Lloyd Ripley-Evans, and Lloyd specializes in cultivating human potential, but he's a psychologist and a consultant, coach, speaker, and author of The Core, the fundamental of me, us, and them. So welcome, Lloyd.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm glad to be here and to connect with your audience.
Well, thank you so much for being here with me, because I think this conversation will be very useful for a lot of the viewers, as my viewers are quite a mixed bunch, and we have both students and supervisors, a bit of business people as well, and you are a psychologist, and you know more about us and the interpersonal communication than anyone else. So I think this is going to be a great conversation about exactly that, the interpersonal communication and bi-directional communication with your peer.
Absolutely. I think communication is at the heart of what we do every day. And if we sort of not getting it right, we're constantly going to be missing the mark and either creating or experiencing frustration in some shape or form. So absolutely, I think let's get into that.
So I invited you here because I know the back end of being a student, and I had some conversations, whether with some students or some supervisors, and I know that there is a lot of traction sometimes in this setup, especially that university has this very informal communication structure in some ways, especially if you're working in the lab, and you have a student coming to the lab with the communication with the supervisor, and sometimes that communication becomes less formal, but you're still kind of a student-supervisor hierarchy. So, and then comes the tension, because we are all humans, we have bad days, we have good days. So can you tell us more about what are the biggest obstacles when there are two people communicating?
Well, I think probably the biggest obstacle when it comes to communication is a misalignment between the individuals. And when I talk about misalignment, it's where we sort of end up speaking past each other, where we're not really clear on maybe ours or the other person's intention behind the communication. So number one is, are we aware of why we're communicating with this person in a certain way? And are we aware of why they're talking to us and communicating with us in a certain way? Clarifying roles and responsibilities. Am I talking to my supervisor, or am I talking to my supervisor who's actually also more of a friend? And being able to differentiate between the roles that we're communicating in or from, who's talking to us, and the purpose behind that communication, we start to create a sense of alignment. Without the alignment, we can be talking past each other, through each other, which can lead to a lot of misunderstanding, can provoke a number of emotions or frustrations in us. So I think one of the biggest obstacles is I think that misalignment between two people. I think another sort of obstacle is personal insecurities, because our insecurities are with us all day, every day. And they can really feature in how we communicate, when we communicate, and what we communicate. And communication is, the statistics vary from 70% to 95% non-verbal, which means that verbal, the words we use, is a small percentage of the actual communication. And when we're fighting our own insecurities as individuals, they can certainly interfere in how we present our communication to another person, or how we receive it, which can significantly impact the messages that are being sent and received. So I think, those misalignments within communication, and probably our own insecurities, or insecurities just in general, are probably the two biggest barriers that I can think of.
But when you're talking about alignment in such setups, so what would you advise? Because certain universities have ways of writing the memorandum of understanding where you're specifying the roles and requirements, but that's just on paper. And in practice, it kind of falls apart, and paperwork is one thing, but the real life starts after you sign that paper.
So I think, you raise a very good point there, because there is always a need for clarification. And it's irrespective of the type of relationship that we're referring to, whether it's a personal relationship with a partner, a friend, family member, or something a bit more professional, or in the academic space. But there's always a need to clarify. When we assume, there's a number of phrases in quotes about what happens when we assume things. But assumptions can create such significant challenges for us. So taking a second to, just because there's something on paper, let me sit down with you and let me confirm my understanding is this, is it the same with you? And immediately we start creating this alignment. Okay, well, I thought, by these words on the paper, this is what my role was, but you're expecting something different of me. And so we start to sort of almost negotiate in a sense. But even just having these types of alignment conversations require a fair amount of personal insight and awareness, and being able to take that proactive conversational route. But absolutely, the clarification is so key to creating that alignment.
Well, I also think that the other aspect of that might be, as you said, the insecurities and the problem with the hierarchy setup, where you might have the age difference that is quite big, and that automatically might create certain hierarchy. But when the age difference is not that big, which can also happen at the academic setup, it's going to create different type of interaction and dynamics in the relationship.
Absolutely. When we look at communication, I always like to refer to interpersonal communication as every individual being in their own bubble. And our experience from within that bubble is unique. And nobody will ever fully, truly understand it. And some bubbles are further apart because of age, culture, language. There's various reasons. And other bubbles are much closer together, almost seeming like they're merged into one bubble. But the reality is that we all remain in our own bubbles, and we need to, number one, be aware of what is surrounding us. And that is our context, our history, our background, our culture, our outlook on the world, our insecurities. It's a personal awareness and understanding. And then we need to understand who we're talking to. Because if I'm talking to somebody who might be 10 years older than me, I need to consider how they may feel about the age gap. What if I am younger than a student of mine, if I'm a supervisor? How will this student of mine respond to me asking them, critiquing their work? And just because they respond with defensiveness, I need to be able to sort of filter that through and say, okay, well, I can understand why there might be this, and I can learn to respond to that person in that situation as opposed to react, because reactions are more emotional. And it's either a defensiveness, and we either sort of shut ourselves down, or it's an outward reaction where we kind of give back, maybe passive aggressively or just aggressively. So I think having that insight and awareness into myself and where the other person is coming from is so, so important.
So you touched upon a few points. One was the cultural differences, and the other one is self-awareness and emotional intelligence. And then lastly, the criticism. So maybe let's unpack those three very important things. So how to deal with the cultural background differences, let's say?
Well, I think before we get to the cultural sort of background differences, what's more critical, or what's required to be able to engage positively and proactively with people from different spaces, different cultures, religions, it doesn't matter what, just different parts of the same country or town or different departments in universities, is first and foremost self-awareness. Because without the self-awareness and an understanding of why we behave a certain way, why we might have certain triggers, without that insight and awareness, well, we kind of just put ourselves out and into the world, and we're extremely vulnerable. So we engage with a different person and we become extremely reactive, defensive. It's a different culture. We don't understand the culture. So, oh, well, I become slightly reserved because I get uncomfortable with things that I don't understand. And now here's a person from a different culture that I don't understand. They do things a different way, and it makes me uncomfortable. And just immediately we can start to see how the dynamics between these two individuals become strained. Yeah. For no other reason but for that individual feeling insecure within themselves, as an example. So first and foremost, we need to start building and encouraging self-awareness. I think it's over the years gets a pretty bad rap. It's often sort of snubbed at, and I think particularly in the academic spaces where things are quite sort of black and white. Self-awareness, or the idea of self-awareness, is not really sort of focused on or encouraged, but it plays such a critical role to how we engage with the world around us. It influences how we respond or react to situations. And the level of self-awareness that we have is going to influence the level of control or influence that we have on the situations and the people around us.
Yes, that's true. And I guess a lot of scientists might be a bit of control freak because we want to know what's going to happen. And we are also masters of troubleshooting. So when things don't happen the way they are supposed to happen. But I think when it comes to self-awareness, it's slightly different. And self-awareness is the only thing that we actually can control.
I think just very, very importantly on that point, many people have such an outward sort of dominant focus. They focus on the problems outside of them, the people outside of them, how they can solve problems, fix things, make sense of things outside of them. And so often they neglect themselves to make sense of, well, who am I? Why do I value this? Why am I so determined to get this research done? Why do I feel so passionately about it? As opposed to just sort of head down and getting it done, having that awareness to say, okay, well, if we have to change course slightly, it's okay because I'm still fulfilling my purpose with it. And that can only come with self-awareness and introspection and reflection, building ourselves from the inside out.
Well, you see, giving an example of academic setup, everybody will have different goals. So let's say the ultimate holy grail is getting a publication out for a lot of people. But sometimes when you are a student, your holy grail at the moment in life will be just getting a degree. And then you have a difference with your supervisor. What is the goal? And that can create certain conflicts about priorities, and that can create triggers. So how you deal with that? Because you're self-aware what is your priority, but how you deal with this type of conflict when there are two different priorities?
So I think what's key there is assertive conversation, engaging in an assertive manner. And an assertive conversation is where you express a problem or a concern, you suggest an alternative or a compromise of sorts, and you allow for some back and forth sort of negotiation on it. And that, assertive conversation or assertive engagement takes a fair amount of self-control and self-awareness just to initiate. But I think irrespective of the context, when there's two people that might have different goals or focuses, the ability to create, and again, we come back to that sense of alignment, that we can still be trying to achieve different goals, but we still need each other to achieve them. So a student will need their supervisor to achieve their goals of passing their degree and so on. And the supervisor may need the students to help contribute to the research in order to get published or whatever the case. And where there's an understanding that, okay, well, we need to work together, we can clarify, right, so my priority is achieving my degree. But second to that is supporting you to achieve yours, and vice versa, maybe from the other side. Creating that awareness, putting it on the table, we can start to say, right, well, I will, clarify the expectations that the other person can have of us. We can have those open conversations. When those expectations aren't met, we can then have rational conversations to revisit those and reevaluate things. But it's about creating that sense of alignment, understanding where I'm coming from, and assertively engaging with this person, irrespective of their status or class or where they sit in the hierarchy of this sort of institution. There's nothing stopping us from having those positive, assertive conversations.
So that brings us to creating boundaries between student and a supervisor, because again, as much as there is a hierarchy, often the setup itself in a lab might create this kind of loose environment where you joke about different things, and in certain points you catch yourself completely without boundaries. And how you work and function in this kind of environment, because that in itself creates certain problems. And then when it comes to discussing work and getting feedback and criticism, then it might be, oh, wait a minute, you were my friend just now, what happened?
So, I mean, we touched on it a little while ago, but that idea of roles and responsibilities. I mean, there's nothing wrong with you having multiple roles with supervisors or students, being, friends, being able to go out and, have a meal or have a drink and converse in that sort of relaxed space, but also being able to work together in that sort of within that hierarchy. But establishing those boundaries, and depending on the situation and the individuals, some individuals need boundaries to be explicitly stated. Other individuals can sort of work sort of relatively well when there's well-informed assumptions about roles and responsibilities. But I think if there's any space for confusion, both individuals, irrespective of sort of who's in charge or not, everybody has a responsibility to clarify. If you're a student in a class and your supervisor or your lecturers, maybe you feel that they're overstepping the mark, with regards to blurring your sort of studies with their research, and it seems to be more aligned to their research than your development within your degree. I think, it's about how do you assertively have that conversation to say, actually, how does this relate to my degree? Establish that boundary. You can push back gently, because sometimes we, particularly when we're doing something we're passionate about, we can get caught up. And sometimes we need to have a gentle pushback or a reminder. Otherwise, it creates a lot of frustration and resentment at times.
No, that's true. So I asked you earlier about the criticism. How do you convey a good criticism, and how you should teach yourself to respond to the criticism?
So I suppose looking at it from two sides. So maybe firstly from giving constructive criticism. I think what's really important is to ask the question of, well, why am I giving this criticism? Am I giving this criticism because I feel that their work is inferior, they haven't stepped up, they haven't done the work? I need to clarify why. Am I giving them criticism because I feel that they could do better? I feel that maybe they've missed the mark. So clarifying exactly why is the first point. And then looking at, well, how do I achieve my goal? So if I want to provide some positive criticism or some constructive criticism to help support my student to look at an alternative viewpoint, I've got to be cautious, because this comes down to communication. How are they going to receive criticism? If I know that they're an extremely sensitive student in my class that doesn't respond well to feedback, they're often quite sort of withdrawn in class and so on. If I just, give them that open criticism in the middle of class, how are they going to respond? Are they going to hear the right message? And I think that is probably the most important thing, is what message do I want this person to hear? And just because I use the right words doesn't mean that they're still going to hear the right message. So it's understanding that dynamic. So I think that's in terms of giving the criticism. On the other side, receiving criticism can be extremely difficult for people. Some people seem to receive it really well. Other people cannot handle any criticism. And this comes down to our insecurities and how well we know ourselves. So in order to help ourselves be more receptive to criticism, again, and the chance of sounding like a stuck record, it comes to self-awareness. The more aware I am of myself and who I am and how I am, my strengths, weaknesses, and all of that, the more open I am to hearing, and I emphasize hearing, the right type of feedback that I need to hear. I'll be able to, if I'm in a pretty solid space within myself, I'll be able to determine whether the feedback or criticism I'm hearing is maybe personally motivated or professionally motivated. I'll be able to filter out some of the noise so I can hear the message that's intended. Okay, so just like, understanding the relationship dynamic when giving constructive feedback, it's the same when receiving it. If a peer gives you constructive feedback versus your supervisor or lecturer or so on, you're going to receive it slightly differently. But being able to determine the sort of the relationship and who's communicating and why I may value their input or not is very, very important. So it's, self-awareness, insight, and understanding.
Well, as you're saying, self-awareness is the first thing, but when it comes to understanding, let's say you're working with a student that is complete enigma for you, and you don't know, it's a different cultural background than yours, how you're going to read the person. Do you have any tools, specific tools, to know what type of person that person you're having a relationship with is, to know how the dynamics should go throughout the collaboration?
Well, I think, an important point that you raise is, if somebody's from a different country, a different culture, they speak a different language, they may present themselves slightly differently. The way they communicate might be slightly different to how I communicate. And so if I know that a person is we should do this with any person, but more apparent with people from sort of outside of our maybe sort of comfort spaces or immediate awareness, is to possibly engage. If we're feeling like there's something missing, is to ask, is to check, is it a language issue? Is it a cultural issue? What is the boundary? What is the interference taking place? And once you start having those conversations, we can start to look at how we can positively intervene to clarify that, right, well, I perceive the way you talk to be quite aggressive and rude. Meanwhile, it's not intended that way. So as soon as I know that, well, that's just sort of how that person talks, because that's how they speak in their language, maybe it's a little bit more sort of sounds a little bit more harsh. As soon as I understand that, I can receive their communication slightly differently, which means I can respond differently, as opposed to feeling sort of on the back foot. Sure, they're attacking me now. Actually, no, they're just asking a question. They're not attacking. So it's just clarifying. And again, we come back to that idea of alignment. It's engaging in a conversation with a person, and particularly where we feel there might be some tension or friction, we need to ask. We've got to be proactive and ask. Otherwise, it just adds fuel to the fire, potentially.
So I think it's going to be my last question at this point. What happens, how you should overcome a resentment? So let's say that people are listening to our conversation now, and they're like, well, okay, I'm already in past all those conflict steps and I have a resentment, but I still have to work with that person throughout the next year, how the person can overcome the resentment that has been created in the relationship.
So what I like to encourage the clients I work with to do is to shift the focus off of the other person. Because when we sit and we focused on this other person, how this other person is upsetting us, hurting us, they're rude to us, they're expecting too much from us, we focus so much on them, whoever they are. But we lose sight of the fact that we are playing a role in that dynamic. That we determine how we respond, how we react, what we say, when we say it, how we say it. We overlook that. And so when we start to be able to sort of refocus and ask, what is my role in this dynamic? How can I get the most out of this situation? The situation is not going to change. The person's not going to change. I can't change them. But how can I be different? How can I get the most out of this difficult relationship? By shifting the focus and asking those questions, which are directed at myself, I start to empower myself to take positive action so that I can get the most out of a situation, as opposed to building this resentment and ultimately taking less and less and less away from an opportunity, essentially.
No, absolutely. I think like if we are taking already the opportunity towards doing internship in certain lab, then we are already investing our own time in the future and personal development. So we have to think about our own goal as well, that this is our own growth. So any experience, it can be a good experience, even if it's a conflict and you learn how to resolve that conflict.
Absolutely. I think just to clarify, I'm certainly not saying just accept things for what they are. If you're in a very difficult situation, you're feeling uncomfortable for various reasons, you feel your boundaries are being overstepped, take action, say something, do something. But there's a limit to what you can say or do. If you come from a very good, positive engagement, maybe between you and your supervisor, and you've now transitioned to a new supervisor where things are different, we've got to bear in mind that people are different. And maybe I'll never have the previous type of relationship again. So I need to accept certain things. And it's finding the balance between what I can do, what I can influence for the right reasons, and what do I need to accept and work with within my own space. Just sort of balancing those two perspectives.
Yes, I heard about a few tools, and basically whatever you're saying here, I personally find that it's interesting to put it down on paper, not only think about it, but put it down and see it visually, and then have more time for yourself to think about your own thoughts and where they come from and your own emotions, so that it's not only in your head, but once it's down there, it's more solid and you can think about it for the second time and third time. And that helps you to understand also the other side of the conflict or the relationship itself.
Absolutely. And what I'll do is I'll share with you also, so you can share with the listeners a very helpful tool that I put together, which I've called the ATF tool, or Problem Analysis tool, and it's actions, thoughts, feelings. And it's a very simple way to break down a problem between what we do and how we try and engage with the problem, how we think about it or conceptualize it, and how we feel about it. Sounds relatively simple, but it's so interesting how people struggle to break down our problems into these three categories. I think it's a very helpful tool that people can use, as you say, to put it down on paper. And there's also a little bit of structure to help them work through a process to figure out, well, what are my next steps moving forward?
Yes, exactly. Because maybe some conflicts are simple and they can be easily solved with the open, assertive communication. Maybe some are more difficult, and then maybe you need the third person to mitigate the conflict in some way. So everything is down to what situation that we are actually in. And I think that seeing it visually, it helps.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much, Lloyd, for this conversation. I'm going to definitely share the tool that you're going to share with us, and also the link to your book, because you're an author of the book, as I mentioned at the beginning. The book is available on Amazon and take a look, right?
Correct.
And it's called The Core, The Fundamentals of Me, Us, and Them. And do you have any final advice about building relationships in a workspace?
I think when it comes to relationships, we need to bear in mind that everything we do revolves around relationships. And there are two types of relationships. There's relationships we have with other people. And then the most important relationship that we have is our relationship with ourselves. And for me, the starting point is always, always, always your relationship with yourself. So if there's anything that I can encourage, it's to reflect on the relationship that you have with yourself before really looking at trying to tweak and adjust relationships around you. Focus inward first before outwards. I think that's probably my closing comment. But thank you very much for having me. It's been fantastic to chat. Yeah, I think this is really great work that you're doing and sharing this type of information with all sorts of people across all sorts of spaces. Yeah, so great work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and have a great day.
Thank you.